Charleston, South Carolina, January 1829. The marble floors of the nation's capital gleamed under crystal chandeliers, but beneath the polished surface of Washington society, something darker was brewing. In the grand parlors where power was traded like currency and reputations were built on whispers, one woman's defiance would topple a political dynasty and reshape the very course of American history. Her name was Margaret Eaton, and she refused to bow. But this story isn't just about Margaret. It's about the woman who declared war on her, the woman who wielded social exclusion like a blade and turned Washington's drawing rooms into battlefields. Florid Calhoun, wife of the vice president, heiress to one of South Carolina's most powerful fortunes, mistress of a plantation worked by 70 enslaved souls. She was born into a world where bloodlines meant everything and scandal meant death. What Florid Calhoun unleashed that winter would destroy her husband's presidential dreams, fracture Andrew Jackson's cabinet, and set in motion the political forces that would tear the nation apart 30 years later. This isn't the story you learned in school. This is the story of how one woman's moral crusade became a weapon of mass political destruction. Before we dive deeper into this tale of ambition, betrayal, and the price of defiance, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is there. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because what I'm about to reveal will change everything you thought you knew about American history. The air in Washington that January morning was sharp enough to cut glass. Carriages rolled through muddy streets, their wheels grinding against cobblestone still slick with winter frost. Inside the finest homes, fires crackled in hearths while servants moved like shadows, polishing silver that would catch the light of scandal before the month was through. This was a city built on secrets, a place where fortunes rose and fell on the strength of a handshake or the whisper of impropriety. Margaret O'Neill, Eaton, stepped out of her carriage that morning with the kind of confidence that made lesser women clutch their pearls. She was 30 years old, sharp-eyed, quick-tongued, and absolutely unrepentant about the path that had brought her here. The daughter of a tavern keeper, she had married young, been widowed, and then remarried with a speed that set tongues wagging from Georgetown to Capitol Hill. Her new husband, John Eaton, had just been appointed Secretary of War by President Andrew Jackson himself. But Margaret Eaton had made one fatal miscalculation. She believed that power could override propriety. She thought that her husband's position in Jackson's inner circle would shield her from the judgment of Washington's social elite. She was wrong, dead wrong. Because waiting for her in the shadows of respectability was a woman who understood power better than anyone. A woman who had been born into it, raised by it, and married deeper into it. Florid Bono Calhoun had been watching, always watching. Florid wasn't just any political wife. She was aristocracy incarnate, the daughter of Senator John Ewing Calhoun, heiress to vast rice plantations that stretched across the South Carolina low country like green kingdoms. When she married her cousin, John C. Calhoun, in 1811, she hadn't just joined her life to his, she had consolidated two of the most powerful political dynasties in the South. Her dowry alone had transformed John from an ambitious lawyer into a plantation master, owner of Fort Hill, and the 70 human souls who worked its fields. For 18 years, Florid had played the game perfectly. While her husband climbed the political ladder from congressman to senator to secretary of war to vice president, she had maintained the delicate balance of being seen but not heard, influential but never threatening. She had mastered the art of wielding power through silence, of controlling Washington society through the careful orchestration of invitations given and withheld. But Margaret Eaton changed everything. Here was a woman who refused to play by the rules that had governed Floride's entire existence. Margaret spoke her mind at dinner parties. She offered opinions on politics when ladies were supposed to discuss only fashion and weather. She laughed too loudly, stood too close to men who weren't her husband, and worst of all, she acted as if she belonged in the same drawing rooms as women who had been born to privilege. The morning after John Eaton's appointment was announced, Florid Calhoun made a decision that would echo through American history. She would not call on Margaret Eaton. In the rigid social hierarchy of Washington, this wasn't just a snub, it was a declaration of war. The wife of the vice president refusing to pay courtesy calls to the wife of a cabinet member was like a general refusing to salute his commander. It simply wasn't done, but Floride wasn't acting alone. With the precision of a military strategist, she began reaching out to the other cabinet wives. Emily Donaldson, the president's niece who served as White House hostess. Sarah Ingham, wife of the Treasury Secretary. Elizabeth Branch, whose husband headed the Navy Department. One by one, Floride convinced them to join her coalition of exclusion. The strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. They would not invite the Eatons to parties. They would not receive them at home. They would not acknowledge Margaret's presence at public events. They would treat her like she was invisible, and in doing so, they would make her invisible. In a society where social acceptance was the currency of political power, they were about to make Margaret Eaton bankrupt. What these women understood, and what Margaret Eaton had failed to grasp, was that Washington society wasn't just about parties and pleasantries. It was the invisible infrastructure that held the government together. Business was conducted over dinner. Alliances were forged in drawing rooms. Information flowed through networks of wives who gathered for tea and left carrying secrets that could topple administrations. By excluding Margaret Eaton from these networks, Florid Calhoun wasn't just protecting the moral standards of Washington society. She was cutting John Eaton off from the very lifeblood of political power. A cabinet secretary whose wife couldn't secure invitations to the right parties was a cabinet secretary whose influence would wither and die. The first test came at a dinner party hosted by the Dutch minister. The cream of Washington society gathered in silk and jewels, the men in their finest evening wear, the ladies adorned with the kind of diamonds that spoke of old money and older power. When John and Margaret Eaton arrived, the reaction was swift and brutal. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Groups of women turned their backs as Margaret approached. The message was clear and unmistakable. You are not welcome here. Margaret Eaton felt the sting of every turned shoulder, every whispered comment, every pointed absence of invitation. But she had underestimated not just the reach of Florid Calhoun's influence, but the depth of her determination. This wasn't a momentary fit of moral outrage. This was a carefully calculated campaign designed to destroy not just Margaret's social standing, but her husband's political career. Because Florid Calhoun understood something that would define American politics for generations to come. In a democracy, power wasn't just about votes and legislation. It was about perception, reputation, and the ability to control the narrative. And she was about to prove that a woman with the right connections and the right motivation could wield that kind of power more effectively than any man in Congress. The battle lines were drawn. On one side stood Margaret Eaton, defiant and isolated, backed only by her husband's love and her own stubborn pride. On the other stood Florid Calhoun and the combined might of Washington's social elite, armed with the most dangerous weapons in their arsenal: silence, exclusion, and the slow, inexorable destruction of reputation. Neither woman could have predicted what would happen next. Neither could have imagined that their personal war would soon draw in the President of the United States himself, a man whose own wounds ran deeper than anyone knew. Andrew Jackson had buried his wife Rachel just 3 months before taking the oath of office. The campaign of 1828 had been vicious beyond measure, and the attacks on Rachel's character had been the cruelest cut of all. They called her a bigamist, the adulteress, a woman unfit to be First Lady. The lies had spread like poison through newspapers and pamphlets, carried on the tongues of political enemies who cared nothing for the truth. Rachel Jackson died of a heart attack in December 1828, and Andrew Jackson knew exactly who had killed her. Not with bullets or blades, but with words sharp enough to pierce a woman's heart and leave her bleeding in silence. When he looked at Margaret Eaton standing alone at that dinner party, surrounded by the cold shoulders of Washington's finest ladies, he didn't see a controversial cabinet wife. He saw his Rachel. The president's response was swift and terrible. He summoned his cabinet to an emergency meeting, but this wasn't about foreign policy or economic matters. This was about honor, about the sacred duty of men to protect the women they loved from the cruelty of those who wielded reputation like a weapon. Jackson stood before his assembled advisors, his white hair wild, his eyes blazing with the kind of fury that had once driven him to fight duels at dawn. He spoke of evidence, of testimony, of witnesses who could attest to Margaret Eaton's character. He presented documents like a prosecutor building his case, methodically dismantling every whispered accusation that had been leveled against her. But the men sitting around that table weren't swayed by evidence. They were thinking about their own wives, their own social standing, their own political futures. When Jackson finished his passionate defense, the silence that followed was deafening. They would not bend. They would not yield. And in that moment, Jackson understood that he was facing something more dangerous than any battlefield enemy he had ever encountered. Florid Calhoun had turned Washington society into a weapon, and she was pointing it directly at his administration. The president tried everything. He appealed to their sense of justice. He reminded them of their Christian duty to show mercy. He even threatened political consequences for those who continued to ostracize the Eatons. But Florid Calhoun had chosen her ground well. In the drawing rooms and parlors of Washington, she was the one with the power, and she intended to use every ounce of it. The social war escalated with each passing week. Invitations that should have been automatic were mysteriously lost. Calling cards went unanswered. At public events, groups of women would literally turn their backs when Margaret Eaton approached, creating a wall of silk and hostility that no amount of political influence could breach. Margaret tried to fight back. She attended every function she could, held her head high, refused to retreat into the shadows that Florid Calhoun had prepared for her. But isolation is a special kind of torture, especially when it's performed in public, witnessed by everyone who mattered in the small, insular world of Washington politics. The strain began to show. John Eaton found himself increasingly cut off from the informal networks that made government function. Information stopped flowing to him. Invitations to private dinners where real business was conducted dried up. His effectiveness as Secretary of War began to crumble, not because he lacked competence, but because he lacked access. And through it all, Florid Calhoun watched from her position as Second Lady of the United States, orchestrating the destruction with the skill of a master tactician. She never spoke Margaret's name in public. She never openly criticized or condemned. She simply continued to not see, not acknowledge, not include. Her silence was more devastating than any speech could have been. But Florid had made one critical miscalculation. She had underestimated Andrew Jackson's capacity for loyalty and his willingness to sacrifice everything for a principle. The president who had fought the British, defeated the Creek Nation, and conquered New Orleans was not about to surrender to a coalition of society ladies, no matter how powerful their husbands might be. Jackson began to make his own strategic moves. He started inviting the Eatons to every White House function. He personally escorted Margaret into dinner parties, his arm linked with hers, daring anyone to slight her in his presence. He made it clear that supporting the Eatons wasn't just his personal preference. It was a test of loyalty to his administration. The battle lines that had seemed so clear began to blur and shift. Cabinet members found themselves caught between their wives' social convictions and their president's political demands. The administration that should have been focused on governing the nation was instead consumed by a war over who could sit where at dinner parties. Martin Van Buren watched it all unfold with the calculating eye of a master politician. The Secretary of State was a widower, conveniently free from the social constraints that bound his married colleagues. While other cabinet members squirmed between competing loyalties, Van Buren made his choice with decisive clarity. He would champion the Eatons, support his president, and position himself as the solution to a crisis that threatened to tear the administration apart. Van Buren began hosting elaborate dinners where Margaret Eaton was not just invited, but honored as the guest of privilege. He escorted her to public events, engaged her in political conversations that other men's wives were forbidden from joining, and made it clear that in his social circle she was not just accepted but celebrated. The message was unmistakable. While John C. Calhoun's wife led the forces of exclusion, Van Buren offered inclusion. While the vice president's household represented the old guard of moral rigidity, the Secretary of State embodied a new kind of political flexibility. Jackson took notice. Floored, Calhoun began to realize that her moral crusade was having unintended consequences. Every day that the scandal continued was another day that Van Buren gained ground with the president. Every social slight against Margaret Eaton was another mark against her husband's political future. The weapon she had forged to destroy her enemies was beginning to turn in her hands. The plantation mistress who had commanded 70 enslaved souls, who had managed a 1,000-acre estate while her husband climbed the ladder of national politics, was discovering that Washington power operated by different rules than the feudal hierarchies of the South. Here, perception mattered more than bloodline. Loyalty mattered more than propriety. And the president's favor mattered more than all the social conventions that had governed her entire life. As winter turned to spring in 1829, the Petticoat War showed no signs of ending. If anything, it was escalating into something far more dangerous than a simple social scandal. The very foundations of Jackson's presidency were beginning to crack under the pressure, and everyone in Washington understood that something would have to give. The question was no longer whether Margaret Eaton would be accepted by Washington society. The question was whether the United States government could survive a war fought in drawing rooms and decided by women who had never cast a vote but wielded power that could reshape the nation. The answer came in the form of a letter that would change everything. It arrived at the White House on a humid morning in May, carried by a messenger whose hands shook as he delivered it to the president's private secretary. The seal was broken, the contents read, and within minutes Andrew Jackson's face had turned the color of storm clouds gathering over the Potomac. The letter wasn't about Margaret Eaton. It was about something far more explosive, something that reached back into the shadows of Jackson's own past and threatened to destroy not just his presidency, but his very conception of loyalty and friendship. John C. Calhoun, the man he had trusted as his political heir, the vice president who stood next in line for the highest office in the land, had betrayed him years before anyone had ever heard the name Margaret Eaton. Back in 1818, when Jackson had pursued Seminole warriors into Spanish Florida without explicit authorization, triggering an international incident that nearly brought the nation to war, one voice in President Monroe's cabinet had called for his court-martial. One man had argued that the hero of New Orleans should be censured, perhaps even prosecuted for exceeding his authority. That man was John C. Calhoun, then Secretary of War, who had sat in cabinet meetings and voted to destroy Jackson's military career, while smiling to his face and claiming to be his staunchest supporter. Jackson read the letter 3 times before the full weight of the revelation settled in his chest like a stone. For 11 years, he had believed that John Quincy Adams had been his primary enemy in Monroe's cabinet. For 11 years, Calhoun had allowed him to believe that lie while positioning himself as Jackson's loyal defender. The deception was breathtaking in its scope and cruelty. The president's hands trembled as he set the letter aside. This wasn't just political betrayal, it was personal treachery of the deepest kind. Jackson had trusted Calhoun with his political future, had elevated him to the second highest office in the land, had treated him like the son he never had. And all the while, Calhoun had been carrying the secret of his own duplicity like a dagger, waiting for the right moment to strike. But Jackson's rage wasn't just about the past. It was about the present, about the way that revelation cast everything else in a new and terrible light. Floored Calhoun's war against Margaret Eaton suddenly looked different. What if this wasn't really about moral standards or social propriety? What if it was something more calculated, more sinister? What if the vice president and his wife were using the Eaton scandal as cover for a deeper plot against his presidency? The pieces began falling into place with sickening clarity. Calhoun's careful positioning during the Eaton affair, his refusal to rein in his wife's social campaign, his calculated distance from Jackson's defense of Margaret. It wasn't weakness or moral conviction. It was strategy. While Jackson exhausted his political capital defending the Eatons, Calhoun was quietly building alliances with the very forces that opposed the president. Jackson summoned his private secretary and dictated a letter that would seal both men's fates. His words were measured, formal, but underneath the diplomatic language lay a fury cold enough to freeze blood. He demanded an explanation. He wanted to know why Calhoun had concealed his opposition for over a decade. He wanted to understand how the man who claimed to be his closest ally had been his secret enemy all along. When the letter reached Calhoun at his desk in the vice president's office, the South Carolinian knew immediately that his political career was over. Not just damaged, not just delayed, but finished with the finality of a coffin lid closing. He had spent years positioning himself as Jackson's heir apparent, building a network of supporters who expected him to inherit the presidency in 1836. All of that was about to crumble because of words he had spoken in secret more than a decade before. Calhoun's response was everything Jackson had expected and nothing he could forgive. The vice president didn't deny the charges, didn't apologize for the deception, didn't even attempt to explain his reasons. Instead, he wrote a long, legalistic defense of his actions, arguing that he had been constitutionally bound to oppose Jackson's Florida expedition, that duty to the law superseded personal loyalty, that his silence had been motivated by a desire to avoid unnecessary conflict. It was the response of a lawyer, not a friend. And Jackson, reading it in the privacy of his study while rain lashed the windows of the White House, understood that he had never truly known John C. Calhoun at all. The man he had trusted with the future of his political movement was a stranger, someone capable of smiling and shaking hands while planning betrayal. The revelation transformed the entire landscape of Washington politics overnight. Jackson's inner circle, already strained by the Eaton affair, began to fracture along new lines. Those who had supported Calhoun's presidential ambitions found themselves suddenly isolated, their political futures tied to a man who had just been exposed as fundamentally untrustworthy. Those who had aligned with Van Buren discovered that their gamble on the Secretary of State was about to pay dividends beyond their wildest dreams. Van Buren, watching the drama unfold with the satisfaction of a chess master who had seen his opponent's defeat 20 moves in advance, began to position himself not just as Jackson's ally in the Eaton matter, but as his natural successor. The widower from New York, who had championed Margaret Eaton when others abandoned her, was now the only cabinet member Jackson could trust completely. But the real victim of this political earthquake wasn't Calhoun or even Jackson. It was Florid Calhoun, the woman who had started a social war to protect what she saw as the moral foundations of American society. Her husband's political destruction meant the end of her own power, the collapse of everything she had worked to build and maintain. Florid had ruled Washington society like a queen, dispensing favor and disfavor with the authority of someone born to command. Her drawing room had been the center of political intrigue, the place where alliances were forged and enemies identified. Her approval had been essential for any woman hoping to succeed in the capital's social hierarchy. Now, all of that was ending. Not slowly, not gradually, but with the sudden violence of a building collapsing. The women who had followed her lead in ostracizing Margaret Eaton began to distance themselves from the Calhoun name. Invitations that had once flowed freely to the vice president's mansion dried up. The coalition that Florid had so carefully constructed started to crumble as its members calculated the cost of continued association with a family in political freefall. The irony was devastating. Florid Calhoun had wielded social exclusion as a weapon against Margaret Eaton, and now she was discovering what that weapon felt like when it was turned against her. The whispers that had once carried her commands now carried speculation about her family's disgrace. The drawing rooms where she had once reigned supreme became places where her name was mentioned only in hushed tones of pity or contempt. Margaret Eaton, meanwhile, found herself in the surreal position of watching her tormentors destroyed by forces entirely beyond her control. The woman who had endured months of calculated humiliation was suddenly the wife of a cabinet secretary whose star was rising, while the vice president's wife who had orchestrated her exclusion was facing social exile of her own. But Margaret was too intelligent to take satisfaction in Florid's downfall. She understood that her own vindication was entirely dependent on Jackson's continued support, and Jackson's support was motivated not by any real affection for her, but by his own psychological wounds and political calculations. If the president's favor shifted, she could find herself back in the wilderness just as quickly as she had been rescued from it. The summer of 1829 became a season of reckoning in Washington. Jackson, his trust in Calhoun shattered beyond repair, began the delicate process of rebuilding his administration around new loyalties and different priorities. The cabinet meetings that had once been dominated by discussions of the Eaton affair now focused on more fundamental questions of governance and succession. Calhoun, isolated and embittered, began to chart a different course for his political future. If he could no longer hope to inherit Jackson's presidency, he would build his own power base around different principles and different constituencies. The nationalism that had once defined his career gave way to sectionalism. The broad vision of American greatness narrowed to a defense of Southern interests and Southern institutions. This transformation wasn't sudden or dramatic. It emerged gradually, like a photograph developing in a darkroom, revealing features that had been there all along but hidden in shadow. Calhoun's defense of states' rights, his philosophical opposition to federal power, his increasingly strident protection of slavery, all of these positions flowed naturally from his break with Jackson and his search for a new political identity. The petticoat war that had begun as a conflict over social propriety was evolving into something far more dangerous, a fundamental disagreement about the nature of American democracy itself. On one side stood Jackson and his allies, champions of federal authority and presidential power, believers in a strong union that could override local prejudices and sectional interests. On the other side emerged Calhoun and his followers, defenders of state sovereignty and constitutional limits, advocates for a system where federal power was constrained by the will of individual states. These weren't abstract philosophical differences. They were practical disagreements with real consequences for real people. The enslaved workers on Florid Calhoun's plantation, the 70 human souls whose labor had built the Calhoun family's wealth and status, were about to become symbols in a larger argument about freedom and bondage, federal power and state authority. Jackson, the slaveholder who had built his own fortune on the backs of enslaved workers, found himself increasingly at odds with the very system that had made his wealth possible. Not because he had developed moral objections to slavery, but because he understood that the defense of slavery was becoming inseparable from the defense of state sovereignty, and state sovereignty was a direct threat to the federal authority he embodied as president. Calhoun, meanwhile, was discovering that his political future lay not in appealing to national constituencies, but in championing the specific interests of the South. The plantation system that had made his wife an heiress was under increasing pressure from abolitionists in the North, and defending that system required a political philosophy that elevated state power over federal authority. The personal had become political in the most literal sense. The social war that florid Calhoun had started in Washington drawing rooms was metastasizing into a constitutional crisis that would define American politics for the next 30 years. The woman who had refused to call on Margaret Eaton had set in motion forces that would ultimately lead to nullification, secession, and civil war. As autumn arrived in Washington, bringing crisp air and the first hints of winter's approach, the capital's political landscape looked nothing like it had just months before. Jackson's cabinet was in shambles, his vice president was a political enemy, and his administration was focused more on managing internal conflicts than governing the nation. The president, aged and weathered by decades of warfare and political combat, found himself facing the most serious crisis of his presidency. Not foreign invasion or economic collapse, but something more insidious and potentially more dangerous: the fracturing of the Democratic coalition that had brought him to power. Van Buren, ever the strategist, understood that crisis created opportunity. The collapse of Calhoun's presidential ambitions had cleared the path for his own ascension, but only if he could help Jackson navigate the treacherous political waters ahead. The Secretary of State began positioning himself not just as Jackson's ally, but as his indispensable partner in the work of healing the wounds that the Petticoat War had opened. But some wounds run too deep for healing. Some betrayals cut too close to the bone. And as winter approached Washington once again, everyone understood that the conflicts that had begun with a refused social call were about to transform into something far more serious than anyone had imagined. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test not just the strength of Jackson's presidency, but the very foundations of the American Republic itself. The first snowfall of winter 1830 dusted the cobblestones of Pennsylvania Avenue like ash from a dying fire. Inside the halls of government, the air itself seemed to crackle with tension so thick you could taste it on your tongue. What had begun as whispers in parlors had become shouts in the corridors of power, and everyone in Washington understood that they were witnessing something unprecedented in American politics. Andrew Jackson paced his study like a caged wolf, his white hair wild from running his fingers through it, his eyes blazing with the kind of fury that had once driven British forces from New Orleans. The letter from Calhoun sat on his desk like a coiled snake, each word dripping with the poison of legal justification and constitutional theory. No apology, no remorse, just cold, calculated defense of betrayal, dressed up in the language of duty and principle. The president's response would echo through history, though no one in that room could have predicted its ultimate consequences. Jackson didn't just reject Calhoun's explanations. He severed their relationship with the finality of a guillotine blade. The political alliance that was supposed to define the next generation of American leadership died in that moment, killed by secrets too heavy to carry and lies too deep to forgive. But Jackson's fury wasn't just about personal betrayal. It was about something deeper, something that struck at the very core of his understanding of loyalty and honor. In the rough world of frontier politics, where Jackson had learned his craft, a man's word was his bond. You fought for your friends and against your enemies, and everyone knew which side you were on. The idea That someone could smile to your face while plotting your destruction was more than political treachery. It was a violation of the natural order itself. And so, the drawing rooms of Washington became the birthplace of the Civil War. What began with Lord Calhoun's refusal to call on Margaret Eaton transformed into the philosophical divide that would split the nation in half. The heiress, who wielded social exclusion like a sword, had unsheathed forces she could never control. Jackson would serve 2 terms. Van Buren would inherit the presidency, and Calhoun would become the intellectual architect of secession. The Petticoat War proved that sometimes the most dangerous battles are fought not with bullets, but with silence. Power, loyalty, and the price of defiance, written in blood across the pages of American history.